I am American, and I've got some Scottish heritage, so I'd always wanted to explore the Highlands. I spent some time making my way north from Edinburgh, staying in hostels and small bed and breakfasts along the way. By the time I reached the Northern Highlands, I was feeling pretty confident in my hiking abilities. I'd done some challenging trails and even wild camped a few times. So when I heard about this remote trail that wasn't on most tourist maps, I thought, why not? It was supposed to lead to this hidden loch that was supposedly one of the most beautiful spots in all of Scotland. The trailhead was near this tiny village. Honestly, it was more like a handful of houses clustered around a pub. I stopped in for a bite before heading out, figuring I'd stock up on some energy for the hike. The pub was one of those old cozy places with a low ceiling and a fire crackling in the corner. It was pretty empty when I went in, just a couple of old-timers nursing pints at the bar. I ordered some food and got to chatting with the bartender, telling him about my plans to hike out to the loch. The change in atmosphere was noticeable. The bartender got this weird look on his face. He tried to play it off, saying something about the weather being unpredictable this time of year, but I could tell there was more to it. I pressed a bit, asking if there was something I should know about the trail. That's when one of the old-timers spoke up, apparently overhearing my conversation so far. "You don't want to be going out there, lad," he said. "That place is not right." I laughed at first, thinking they were just trying to scare the tourist, but that old man was dead serious. He told me that people had gone missing on that trail over the years. Not many, and not often, but enough to make the locals wary. "There's something out there," he said, his voice low. "Something old, something that doesn't like visitors." Now, I'm not usually one for superstition, but the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. Still, I figured they were just being overprotective. I thanked them for the warning but said I was still planning to go. The bartender sighed and said, "If you must go, at least take this." He handed me a small, smooth stone with some kind of symbol carved onto it. "Old protection," he said. I pocketed the stone more to be polite than anything else, finished my meal, and headed out. The trail started off easy enough, winding through some beautiful pine forests, but as I got further in, things started to change. The trees got older, thick and overgrown. The undergrowth thickened too, making the trail harder to follow. Before long, there was this smell, kind of musty and sweet at the same time, like rotting flowers. It wasn't strong, but it was persistent. I'd been hiking for about 3 hours when I realized I should have reached the loch by now. I checked my map but had definitely made a wrong turn somewhere. I wasn't seeing any of the landmarks I was supposed to be seeing. I tried to backtrack but didn't locate anything familiar. Now get this. As I was walking, the forest was filled with the sounds of nature, and literally, the next single step I took, the moment my foot hit the ground, everything fell silent. That was extremely disturbing. Not too long after, that smell got stronger. I was kind of freaked out and decided to set up camp for the night right there and get my bearings in the morning. I found a nice open space and got my tent set up just as it was getting dark. That night, I still have nightmares about it. I woke up because I was hearing a whispering sound. At first, I thought it was wind through the trees, but it kept getting clearer until I could hear words. Words that I couldn't clearly make out yet, but it was very obviously multiple voices talking over each other, and they seemed to be getting closer. I double-checked my tent, making sure the zipper was all the way up. I told myself to calm down, that it's nothing out of the ordinary. Then I saw shadows on the tent wall, thanks to it being a clear night with a bright moon. Something was moving around out there, and the shapes they cast were wrong, very tall, very thin, moving in ways that nothing should. I was paralyzed, just frozen there, left to watch. The whispers grew louder, and I could smell that sickly sweet odor right outside the tent. Then something brushed up against the side. I had to bite my lip to keep from screaming. This went on for a few hours. Sometimes the shadows would retreat, and I would think it was over, but then they'd come back even closer than before. By the time dawn finally came, I was a wreck. As soon as there was enough light out, I packed up my things and started hiking again. This time I didn't care which direction, I just wanted out. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Around late afternoon, I could hear running water. I pushed through some bushes and found myself on the shore of a loch. But this wasn't the beautiful, peaceful place I'd been told about. The water here was dark, almost black, and there was a very thick mist hanging over it. The trees around the shore were twisted and wrong, their branches reaching out over the water like grasping fingers. And there were stones, standing stones forming a rough circle near the water's edge. They were covered in markings similar to the one on the stone the bartender had given me. As I looked at them, I felt a pressure building in my head, like right before a migraine. I suddenly saw ripples forming on the water's surface. Something was moving around out there. Something big, something coming my way. Before I saw it emerge, I bolted out of there. I don't remember much of what happened next, just crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping my face, that sickly sweet smell all around me. I could hear something moving through the woods behind me too, I swear, but I didn't dare look back. Thank heavens I found my way out somehow. Everything was really just a blur. By the time I came out I was scratched up and babbling about monsters in the loch. The locals didn't seem surprised. I went back to my hostel, got cleaned up, and drank some strong tea. When I finally settled myself down, I went back to that pub to return the stone. When I tried to give it to the old man, he shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "You might need it again someday." I left the Highlands the next day, taking some new lifelong memories and scars with me. I was about halfway through my trek along the Great Divide Trail in the Canadian Rockies. It was late August, and the plan was to hike the entire route from Waterton Lakes National Park up to Kakua Provincial Park. It was a trip I'd been dreaming about for years. I'm from Vancouver, but I'd never really explored much of the wilderness in my own backyard, always too busy with work and life and all that. But I'd finally saved up enough vacation time and money to take a couple of months off and just disappear into the mountains. That particular day had been rough. I'd been pushing myself hard, trying to make up for lost time after waiting out a nasty storm a few days back. My legs were aching, my feet were blistered, and I was starting to run low on supplies. I knew I'd have to detour off the trail soon to resupply, but I was hoping to push on for one more day. As evening started to set in, I realized I'd miscalculated. I was nowhere near my planned campsite, and the terrain was too steep and rocky to safely set up camp. From there, I spotted a faint light in the distance off to the east of the trail. It had to be a farm or maybe a ranger station, I thought. So, I figured I'd head that way, see if I could camp on the edge of their property for the night to be safe. Worst case, maybe they'd let me refill my water. It took me about an hour to reach the place. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a farmhouse, one of those old two-story jobs that looked like it had been there for generations. There was a barn off to one side, and I could see a few outlying buildings that I guessed were sheds or workshops. The whole place was surrounded by fields, with the forest pressing in close on all sides. I was about to head up to the house when something made me hesitate. I can't really explain it, to be honest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and something just felt wrong. You spend enough time in the wilderness, I guess you develop a sort of sixth sense for danger. This felt like that, but different, more unsettling somehow. And then I saw it. Something that at first I thought was a person. There was a figure standing by one of the ground floor windows of the farmhouse. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized it was way too big to be human, and the shape was all wrong. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, covered in what looked like shaggy dark fur. But it wasn't shaped like a bear. It was standing on 2 legs, body hunched forward in a way that looked unnatural. Its arms, if you could call them that, were long, and ended in what looked like huge clawed hands. I froze, afraid to move. The creature had not seen or sensed me yet. It was completely focused on that window. As I watched, it leaned in closer, pressing its face against the glass. And then, God, I can barely bring myself to describe it. It began to lick the window, long, slow strokes of its tongue against the glass. The sound carried clearly in the still night air, this wet, raspy noise that made my skin crawl. I'm not sure how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear, before finally, the creature pulled back from the window. It turned its head, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I'd been spotted. It let out a low, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, then loped off into the darkness of the surrounding forest. I waited until I was sure it was gone, then practically ran up to the farmhouse. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely knock on the door. A middle-aged man answered, looking understandably confused to find a disheveled hiker on his doorstep at night. I opened my mouth, ready to spill everything I'd just seen, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain what I'd witnessed without sounding completely insane? Instead, I forced a sheepish smile and said, "I'm so sorry to bother you this late. I was hiking out here and got myself completely turned around. Could you possibly point me in the direction of the nearest town?" The man's confusion turned to concern. "You're pretty far from any marked trails, son. Everything all right?" I nodded, perhaps a bit too eagerly. "Yeah, I took a wrong turn somewhere, lost track of time." He studied me for a moment, then glanced over his shoulder into the house. "Look, it's pitch black out there, and the terrain's treacherous if you don't know it. Why don't you come in for a bit? My wife just put on some coffee." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But another part, well, I couldn't just leave without saying something, could I? And I really did need to get my bearings. "That's really kind of you, thank you," I said, stepping inside. The warmth hit me immediately, making me realize how cold I'd been. The man introduced himself as John. He led me to a cozy kitchen where his wife, Sarah, was indeed brewing some coffee. She gave me a warm smile and set about pouring me a cup. As I sat there, hands wrapped around the steaming mug, I wrestled with what to say. I couldn't tell them the exact truth, but I couldn't say nothing either. Actually, I saw something before I came to your door," I started, my heart pounding. "I'm not sure how to say this, but, well, I think I saw a strange man peering through one of your ground floor windows." John and Sarah exchanged a look. It wasn't the reaction I expected, not shock or fear, but more like resignation. "Which window?" John asked, his voice low. I pointed in the general direction. "Over there, I think, on the side of the house." Sarah's face paled. "That's Emily's room," she whispered. John stood up abruptly. "I'll go check on her and have a look around outside." As he left, Sarah turned to me. "Thank you for telling us. We've had issues with trespassers before. Not sure why, but this area attracts all sorts of strange folk." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and now wondering if I counted as one of those strange folk. I wanted to say more to her, to warn her about what I'd really seen, but I just couldn't. John came back a few minutes later. "Emily's fine," he said to Sarah, sleeping soundly. "Didn't see anyone outside, but I'll do a more thorough check in the morning." They offered to let me sleep in the spare bedroom, next to their bedroom, so they could keep an eye on me. John agreed to stay up anyway, in case that man came back, but also probably because he wanted to keep an eye on me too. I gratefully accepted the offer, but truthfully, I spent most of the night staying up and talking to John, discussing goings-on in the woods, what he does for a living, how life was out on the farm. In the morning, John gave me directions to the nearest town where I could resupply. I thanked them for their hospitality and set off, glad to put some distance between myself and whatever I'd seen the night before. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I finished my hike and went back to a normal life, chalking the whole thing up to dancing shadows in the night, or maybe just a really big bear. But I still couldn't shake it off. It nagged at me, demanded answers. About 6 months later, I found myself driving through that way and decided I would drop by the farm to pay them a visit. I told myself I was just being thorough, tying up loose ends before I wrote up my trail journal, but deep down, I think I wanted to make sure that everyone there was okay. And I was extremely grateful for how kind they were. I don't think I could have walked any further in those woods in the dark, knowing that something like that lived out there. The farm looked different in the daytime, peaceful and ordinary. John seemed surprised to see me, but he invited me in for coffee. We chatted for a bit about nothing in particular, the weather, how my hike had gone, that sort of thing. At a certain point, I asked how Emily was doing. John got real quiet. He looked out the window for a long moment. Emily was a sickly child, weak lungs, the doctor said. To be frank with you, she passed away in her sleep only a week after you were here. I was taken aback, didn't know what to say. My God, I'm so sorry, I managed to finally say. It felt inadequate. The thing is, John continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you mind if I share something strange? John asked. I nodded. The night before she died, Emily told us she'd been having dreams, said John. Said there was a big dog that would come to her window at night, said it would lick the glass and tell her not to be afraid. I only want to bring it up because it reminds me of the man you saw at her window that night. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. John continued. She said it spoke to her in her dreams, told her it would take her somewhere she wouldn't be sick anymore. He looked at me, his eyes starting to shine with unshed tears. I've been wondering if it was the fever talking. I think about it a lot lately, that maybe these dreams she had helped her to pass on. We sat in silence for a long while after that. What could I even say? Eventually, I made my excuses, thanked him profusely again for the coffee, and for the kindness his family showed me that night, then left. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the image of that creature at the window. Had it really been there for Emily? Despite how disturbing it looked, was it some kind of spirit guide, or was it something darker, something that caused the girl to die? I've turned it over in my mind 1,000 times since then, and I still don't know, but I've had plenty of nightmares about it ever since. I'm asking anyone and everyone who hears this story or reads it, what do you think it could have been? A benign creature or spirit trying to help the little girl, knowing that she was about to pass, or some sort of evil monster that cursed the girl to die? I had gone backpacking through northern Michigan after graduating from college, wanting to do a solo trip to clear my head before starting my job hunt. Originally from the suburbs of Chicago, I wasn't exactly an experienced outdoorsman, though I had done some camping as a kid. I figured I could handle a week-long trek through the Hiawatha National Forest. Looking back, I was pretty naive and underprepared. I had decent gear, a good backpack, tent, sleeping bag, etc., but I had never really done any serious backcountry hiking before. I plotted out a route that would take me on a big loop through some of the more remote parts of the forest, figuring I'd cover about 10 miles a day. In retrospect, that was way too ambitious for my skill level. The first couple of days were actually great. The weather was perfect with clear skies and temperatures in the low 70s. I was making decent time and really enjoying the solitude. There's something magical about being alone in nature, surrounded by nothing but trees and birdsong. I would stop occasionally to filter water from streams or take photos of particularly scenic spots. At night, I would make camp, eat some trail mix or dehydrated meals, and fall asleep to the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was on the third night that things started to get weird. I had hiked a little farther than usual that day, pushing myself to reach a small lake I had marked on my map as a good campsite. By the time I got there, the sun was already dipping below the tree line. I quickly set up my tent and got a small fire going, wanting to eat and get settled before dark really set in. As I sat by the fire heating up some soup, I had the sudden feeling of being watched, you know, that prickly sensation at the back of your neck. But this was more intense. I looked around, scanning the trees at the edge of my little clearing, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. Being alone in the woods can play tricks on your mind. But as the night wore on, the feeling only intensified. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing there. The forest's sounds seemed to change too. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets and frogs went quiet, replaced by an eerie stillness, which was only broken by the occasional snapping of a twig in the dark. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I'd start to drift off, I would jerk awake, convinced I'd heard footsteps, or breathing just outside my tent. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted and on edge. Part of me wanted to pack up and hightail it back to civilization, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I'd come out here for an adventure after all, so I shouldered my pack and pressed on. The next day was odd. I couldn't quite put my finger on why, but something felt off about the forest. The trees seemed denser, the shadows deeper. I'd check my maps and compass, only to find that I didn't seem to be making much progress. Not as much as I should. The landmarks I was looking for never seemed to materialize. It was as if the landscape itself was subtly shifting around me. By late afternoon, I had to admit I was lost. None of the terrain matched my map anymore. I thought about trying to backtrack, but I couldn't even be sure which direction I'd come from. The sun was hidden behind a thick canopy, and my compass was spinning wildly, the needle swinging in circles. As I began to panic, I stumbled into another clearing. That's when I saw it for the first time. It was... I don't even know how to describe it right, but I'll do my best. It was a figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, impossibly tall, about 8 feet or more. It was thin, like a shadow given 3D form. It didn't seem to have distinct features, just a vague humanoid shape that hurt my eyes to look at directly. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched. I don't know how I knew that since I couldn't see any eyes, but I swear I felt its gaze boring into me. After a while, I backed away slowly. The figure remained motionless. As soon as I reached the tree line, I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, collapsing in a heap on the forest floor. As I lay there gasping for breath, the shadows lengthened around me. Night was falling again, and I was nowhere near any state to make camp. I knew I should get up, find water, set up a tent, but I was paralyzed by fear, exhaustion, and confusion. That's when I heard it. A chittering sound, high-pitched and insectile, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And underneath it, a deeper sound, a rhythmic thumping, like massive footsteps getting closer. I scrambled to my feet, all fatigue forgotten in a fresh wave of adrenaline. I picked a direction at random, and ran again, quieter this time, trying to listen for pursuit over the sound of my own ragged breathing. I'm not sure how long I fled through the darkening forest. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The trees began to look twisted into unnatural shapes. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy and uneven. At some point, I became aware that the chittering had stopped. The forest was once more deathly quiet. I slowed to a walk, straining my ears for any sign of danger. And then I saw the lights ahead of me. Weaving between the trees were tiny points of bluish-white light. They moved like fireflies on a mission. Despite every instinct screaming at me to run the other way, I found myself drawn towards them. As I got closer, I realized the lights were coming from small ethereal figures flitting through the air. They seemed to take notice of me. They began to circle around, and unbelievably, they seemed to form a path through the woods. Some part of me knew I shouldn't follow, but I was beyond rational thought at that point. I stumbled after the lights, pushed onwards by equal parts curiosity and desperation. I was led into a meadow where the trees began to have these strange symbols carved into their bark. I stopped for a moment, reaching out to touch one of the symbols. As my fingers brushed the rough bark, the world seemed to shift. Or maybe I just blacked out. The next thing I remember was opening my eyes, and the lights were gone, and everything felt, well, normal again. In fact, my surroundings had changed. In the distance, I saw lights, different lights. These were man-made, the outskirts of a small town that was not there before. I made my way there in a hurry, finding the nearest street. People were looking at me strangely. I'm assuming my appearance didn't help. I had to have been filthy, scratched up, and wild-eyed. I found a convenience store and went inside. I went right up to the counter and asked, "Excuse me," my voice sounding hoarse. "Can you tell me where I am?" He gave me the name of a town I'd never heard of, in a state hundreds of miles from where I'd started my hike. "What day is it?" I asked. I dreaded the answer. When he told me, my knees felt weak. Somehow, impossibly, over 2 weeks had passed since I had entered that forest. 2 weeks that I had no memory of. The convenience store let me use the phone, and I called my parents. They were hysterical. Apparently I'd been reported missing after failing to return from my trip on schedule. Search parties had combed the area where I was supposed to be hiking but found no trace of me. I never did come up with a satisfactory explanation for what happened. The official story is that I got lost in the woods and wandered in a delusional state for 2 weeks before finding my way back to civilization. I know that's not true, but it's easier than trying to explain the unexplainable. I've since gone hiking again. I still do go hiking on occasion, but I don't go alone anymore, and I never go in too deep. Nowadays, no matter what, I feel like I'm always catching a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, something darting between the trees, and I wonder if that's PTSD from my experience. The moment I step foot into woods anywhere, I always feel watched. It's funny how some memories from childhood stick with you. Most of the time I can barely remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, but this one night from when I was 11 is burned into my brain like it happened last night. This was back in '92. I was in the 5th grade. My best friends were Tommy and Jesse. Tommy lived on the edge of town where the suburbs gave way to farmland. His house backed up to this big open field that led to a hill we called the Mound. It wasn't much of a hill really, but when you're a kid, everything seems bigger. It was a Friday night, and we were having a sleepover at Tommy's place, but this wasn't going to be any ordinary sleepover. No, we had big plans. We were going to be real adventurers. Tommy's parents had finally agreed to let us camp out on top of the mound. Well, sort of. We could go up there with our sleeping bags and backpacks, hang out until 9 p.m., then come back to sleep in the house. It wasn't exactly roughing it in the wilderness, but to us, it was the height of adventure. We'd been planning this for weeks. Our school backpacks were stuffed with all the essentials: flashlights, comic books, enough snacks to feed a small army, and of course, our trusty Swiss Army knives. We felt like real explorers, ready to tame the wild half-mile between Tommy's back porch and the top of the mound. Tommy's mom made us sandwiches for dinner, reminding us for the 100th time to be careful and stay together. We nodded impatiently, eager to get started on our grand expedition. As soon as we finished eating, we were out the door, our backpacks weighing us down as we set off across the field. The sun was just starting to set as we began our trek. The mound loomed ahead of us, awaiting us under a darkened sky. Jesse was the warrior of the group. He kept glancing back at Tommy's house, which was growing smaller behind us. "You're not scared, are you?" I teased. Jesse puffed up. "No way, I was just making sure we're going the right direction." Tommy laughed. "It's a straight line, dummy. We can't get lost." We continued on, the tall grass of the field giving way to the steeper, rockier slope of the mound. It wasn't a difficult climb, but we took our time anyway, pretending we were scaling some great mountain peak. When we finally reached the top, we were out of breath but grinning from ear to ear. "We made it," Tommy crowed, dropping his backpack and raising his arms in victory. "We've conquered the mound." Jesse and I cheered along with him, caught up in the moment. We felt like kings of the world, looking down at the twinkling lights of our small town spread out below us. We then set about making our camp, which mostly consisted of laying out our sleeping bags in a rough circle, piling up our snacks in the middle. Tommy had brought a small battery-powered lantern, which we placed in the center of the circle. It cast a warm glow over our little campsite as the last traces of daylight faded from the sky. We broke into our snacks and started to tell ghost stories, the usual stuff kids tell around a campfire, like hook-handed killers and vengeful spirits. Jesse was in the middle of a particularly creepy tale about a babysitter and a killer hiding upstairs when Tommy went still. "Guys," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look up there." We followed his gaze up to the night sky. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just stars twinkling like they always did. But then I saw it. A light brighter than any star, moving slowly across the sky. "It's just a plane," Jesse said, but he didn't sound convinced. The light was moving too slowly to be a plane, and it was getting bigger, brighter, much brighter. "Maybe it's a meteor," I suggested, my voice shaking a bit. But it wasn't like any meteor I'd ever seen or read about. The light kept growing, from a pinprick to the size of a dime, then a quarter. It was so bright it was hard to look at directly, but we couldn't take our eyes off it. That's when things got fuzzy. I remember the light getting so bright it seemed to fill the whole sky. I remember a humming sound so low I felt it more than heard it. And I remember feeling very, very sleepy all of a sudden. The next thing I knew, someone was shaking me awake. I opened my eyes to find Tommy's dad leaning over me, looking worried. "You okay?" he asked, helping me sit up. "We've been calling for you for about an hour." I looked around, disoriented. Tommy and Jesse were just waking up too, looking as confused as I felt. Our campsite was a mess, sleeping bags twisted, snacks scattered everywhere, the lantern was off, its batteries apparently dead. "What happened?" Tommy asked, his voice groggy. His dad sighed. "No idea. You had us worried sick. Why didn't you come back at 9, like we agreed?" We looked at each other, baffled. How could it already be past 9? It felt like we just laid down in our sleeping bags only a few minutes ago. "We must have fallen asleep," Jesse said, but he didn't sound sure. Tommy's dad helped us pack up our things and led us back down the mound. As we walked, I was trying to piece together what had happened. The ghost stories, the light in the sky, and then nothing. It was like someone had just erased a few hours of my memory. When we got back to Tommy's house, his mom was waiting for us on the porch. She looked mad at first. Then relief washed over her face when she saw us. She hugged each of us in turn, then sent us off to get ready for bed. As I was brushing my teeth, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror, and froze. There, just behind my ear, was a small, perfectly round bruise. I hadn't noticed it before, and I had no idea how I'd gotten it. When I asked Tommy and Jesse later, they both found similar marks on themselves. Tommy on his neck, Jesse on his shoulder. We tried to talk about what happened, but none of us could make sense of it. We agreed to keep it to ourselves. Who was going to believe us? The next morning, Tommy's parents seemed to have chalked up the whole incident to us being irresponsible kids who fell asleep and lost track of time. We didn't correct them. How could we explain something we didn't understand ourselves? Life went on, and for a while, we didn't talk about that night on the mound, but things had changed. We had changed. Jesse suddenly became obsessed with UFOs and aliens, spending hours in the library reading every book he could find on the topic. Tommy, on the other hand, refused to even look at the mound. He kept his bedroom curtains closed at night and would change the channel if anything about aliens came on TV. As for me, I found myself watching the sky more often, especially at night. I'd wake up sometimes, heart racing, convinced I'd seen a bright light outside my window, but it was always just the moon or a street light, or me waking from a dream. About a month after our camping trip, Tommy called me in the middle of the night. He was whispering, his voice shaking. "It's back," he said, "the light, it's over the mound right now." I rushed to my window, peering out into the darkness. I couldn't see the mound from my house, but the sky in that direction did seem brighter than it was supposed to be. "What do we do?" I asked. "Nothing," Tommy replied. "We pretend we never saw it. We never talk about this again, okay?" I agreed, wondering why he even called me then, but I couldn't help feeling like we were making a mistake, like we were ignoring something important. The years went by, and we grew up. During high school, Jesse moved away. His family relocated for his dad's job. Tommy and I drifted apart as childhood friends sometimes do. Every now and then I might run into Tommy during one of my college breaks. Whenever I heard from Jesse again, he was still very much into UFOs, but in a more academic way. He was studying astronomy, he told me, hoping to work for SETI one day. Tommy, though? Well, Tommy never got over that night. He joined the military right out of high school, saying he wanted to be as far from the mound as possible. Eventually, he got his wish, and I stopped seeing him during those college breaks. I guessed he made it somewhere overseas or to a different state for training. I tried to put it all behind me. I told myself it was simply a weird childhood experience, one possibly fueled by too many sci-fi movies and wild imaginations. Even so, I wonder. I can't help but feel I'm lying to myself. I've never gone back to the mound, not sure I could even if I wanted to. Last I heard, they built a subdivision there, turning our childhood adventure spot into a cluster of cookie-cutter houses. But part of me is glad, at least kids won't be camping up there anymore, risking, well, whatever it was we encountered. But it also feels like I lost something important. It feels like there was a mystery there, something bigger than us, and we just walked away from it. Maybe we were made to walk away from it. I don't know. Maybe I should finally give it a rest. Stop thinking about it. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved after all. I'll leave you with this. Sometimes I still check behind my ear, half expecting to see that perfectly round bruise again. And whenever I look up at the night sky, I feel like something might be looking back. I had always been drawn to the obscure and forgotten tales that linger in the shadows of the world, where the modern age has yet to fully cast its light. Romania, with its rich tapestry of history and mystery, seemed like the perfect canvas for an eager anthropology student like myself. The idea of spending a summer trekking through its remote villages to unearth ancient folklore was romantic, almost like stepping into the pages of a storybook. As the plane descended into Bucharest, the panorama below shifted from sprawling cityscapes to the rolling hills and dense forests that characterize much of the country's landscape. The transition was like watching the past and present collide, a reminder of why I had chosen this place. I felt a mix of exhilaration and nervous anticipation stirring in my chest as I collected my backpack from the overhead compartment. The first few days were spent navigating through well-trodden paths in cities like Brasov, where Gothic spires and medieval fortresses spoke of centuries past. I conversed with local historians and gathered narratives that, while rich, felt polished by frequent retelling. What I sought was something raw, tales that were woven into the fabric of smaller communities, those not found in tourist guides or history books. Driven by this desire, I rented a car and headed towards the Carpathian Mountains. The drive was scenic, with each winding turn offering vistas of valleys bathed in the golden light of the late June sun. Yet as the day waned, the shadows seemed to stretch across the road, almost as if they were reaching out from the dense woodlands that flanked my path. I arrived at the village just before dusk. It was the kind of place you might miss if you blinked. A handful of weathered houses clustered around a time-worn church, its steeple piercing the sky. There was no hotel, only a small store that doubled as a post office, its windows displaying an eclectic mix of goods. The villagers eyed me with a mixture of curiosity and wariness as I parked the car and stretched my legs. Their gaze followed me as I approached the store, their whispers barely audible over the creak of the sign swaying gently in the evening breeze. Inside, I asked the storekeeper about a place to stay. With a cautious glance, she directed me to a house on the outskirts of the village, where an elderly woman rented out a room to the occasional wanderer. Her home was a quaint ivy-clad cottage, the garden blooming with wildflowers that released their fragrance into the cooling air. The woman, Mrs. Popescu, greeted me with a nod and a cautious smile, her English broken but sufficient. Through a combination of my patchy Romanian and expressive gestures, we agreed on a price, and she showed me to my room. The room was simple. A single bed with a hand-knitted quilt, a wooden chair, and an old wardrobe that looked as if it could tell stories of its own. The window offered a view of the forest, trees standing like silent sentinels against the sky. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked, a stark contrast to the bustling energy of the cities I had left behind. That night, as I lay in bed, the excitement of the day gave way to the silence of the village. It was a silence so profound it almost had a presence of its own. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, a faint sound teased the edges of my consciousness. It was a soft, insistent scratching, like nails gently scraping against glass. Heart pounding, I sat up and looked towards the window. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A face, perhaps, pale and distorted by the glass. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the whisper of leaves outside. I told myself it was nothing, just the remnants of a dream, or the trickery of shadows. But as I lay back down, a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was very different here, and perhaps I had ventured further into the unknown than I had intended. The morning brought with it a mist that clung to the village like a shroud, muting the colors of the wildflowers and casting the houses in a ghostly pallor. I woke early, restless from the previous night's eerie interruption, and decided to immerse myself in the village life, hoping to glean some of the stories hidden within its quiet boundaries. I started with a walk, the dew-soaked grass whispering under my boots as I moved through the village. The sun, struggling to pierce the fog, cast long, thin shadows that seemed to flicker with my passing. The villagers were already up, tending to gardens or heading off to fields with tools slung over their shoulders. They nodded as I passed, their smiles guarded, and their eyes holding stories that their lips seemed reluctant to tell. I found my way to the small store again, where the elderly storekeeper was arranging bread and other staples on worn wooden shelves. "Good morning," I greeted her in my faltering Romanian, which brought a surprised chuckle from her. Her response was warm but cautious, and when I ventured to ask about the village's history, she paused, her expression turning thoughtful, almost pensive. "We are a simple people," she said finally, "bound by tradition and the land. Perhaps the church's priest could tell you more." She seemed relieved to divert my inquiries elsewhere. Thanking her, I headed towards the church, its steeple looming ominously against the slowly clearing sky. The priest, a stooped figure with a face as cragged as the Carpathian landscape, was sweeping the front steps. He regarded me with a deep-set discerning gaze as I approached. "You are the visitor staying with Mrs. Popescu," he stated more than asked, his voice deep and resonant. "Yes, I'm studying anthropology. I'm interested in the folklore of places like this. Stories that are perhaps not known outside these mountains." The priest set his broom aside, folding his hands. "Folklore, yes, we have plenty, but not all tales are for telling." He sighed, the sound seeming to carry a weight of resignation. "But if stories you seek, then you must learn of our stoy." As he spoke of the stoy, his voice dropped to a whisper, as if the mere mention might invoke their presence. "They are spirits of the dead, restless and roaming. They prey on the unwary, those who do not respect the old ways." His eyes flicked to the forest, and a chill ran down my spine as I remembered the face at the window. "Why tell me this?" I asked, my curiosity piqued despite my unease. "Because knowledge can be a lantern in the dark," he replied cryptically. "Be wary, young lady. Not all spirits are bound by story alone." The rest of the day I spent wandering the edges of the village, my mind spinning with the priest's words. I tried to speak with others, but it was as if the mention of the stoy had erected a wall of silence around me. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the village, I felt a growing sense of dread. What had I stirred by my probing? That night, the scratching returned, more insistent than before. As I lay in my bed, listening to the unsettling sound, I realized that the village's stories were not just remnants of the past, but living, breathing truths that watched from the dark woods and whispered with the wind. And now, they were aware of me. The shadows lengthened into evening as a silence settled over the village, deeper and more complete than any night before. My heart beat with a heightened awareness of every small sound, The distant bark of a dog, the whisper of the wind through the trees, and the soft, eerie scratching at the window that now seemed like a sinister serenade, meant just for me. I lay in bed, frozen, the covers pulled up to my chin. The memory of the priest's warning echoed in my mind, a solemn reminder that I had ventured too far into the dark heart of folklore I so naively sought to explore. The scratching continued, persistent and methodical, as if whatever lurked outside knew I was just beyond the thin pane of glass. "Let me in," a voice whispered, so faint I thought I might have imagined it. "I'm so cold out here." The voice was soft, almost pitiful, but behind its plea, I sensed a trap. It was the stoy, I was sure of it, using its cunning to seek an invitation. Every tale I had ever read about spirits and their machinations swirled through my mind, paralyzing me with fear. I was a stranger here, an outsider, exactly the sort of person the old man had said the stoy preyed upon. I didn't dare move towards the window. I didn't even dare to breathe loudly. My room felt like a cell, and the walls seemed to press in with the cold dampness of the night. Hours dragged by, marked only by the relentless scratching and the occasional whisper, each plea more desperate than the last. "Let me in," but I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I lay there, a silent sentinel in my own besieged fortress, praying for the first light of dawn. The night was a battle of wills, my fear against the cunning of an ancient evil lurking just outside. As the darkness began to thin with the approach of dawn, the scratching faded, the voice dissipated, and a profound stillness took over. When the sun finally broke the horizon, its light felt like a cleansing fire, banishing the night's horrors back into the depths of the forest. I rose from my bed, my body stiff from hours of immobility, my spirit wearied from the ordeal. I didn't bother packing my belongings properly. I just stuffed what I could into my backpack, my hands trembling with the rush to leave. I left some money on the table for Mrs. Popescu, enough to cover my stay and perhaps a bit more, a silent apology for any trouble I might have brought to her door. Without a backward glance I fled the house, my feet carrying me swiftly to the village square, where I caught the first bus heading anywhere but there. As the village receded in the distance, a part of me mourned the loss of innocence, the harsh lesson learned about the reality of the stories I had so eagerly pursued. I spent the remaining weeks of my trip in cities, surrounded by the comforting anonymity of crowds and the constant hum of urban life. Yet, even amidst the bustle of civilization, I kept my curtains tightly drawn each night, a barrier against the dark. I told myself it was just a precaution, a silly habit born from a single terrifying encounter. But sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, I would hear a whisper, carried on the wind, a chill reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. I had always dreamed of exploring the great mountains, and finally, my chance had come. With my backpack ready and my spirits high, I set off for a solo trek across the magnificent French and Swiss Alps. It was going to be a 3-week adventure, and I had everything planned perfectly, or so I thought. The first 9 days were like a dream. I hiked through breathtaking landscapes, took pictures of the sunrise, and even saw a few mountain goats. I was alone, but I felt a thrilling connection to nature. Each night I camped under the stars, feeling a little chilly, but mostly excited about the days ahead. But on the 10th day, everything changed. The sky grew dark, and the wind began to howl as I crossed over into Switzerland. Soon, it wasn't just windy. It was a full-blown storm. The rain poured down so hard it felt like buckets of cold water were being dumped on me. I struggled against the wind, which seemed determined to knock me off my feet. My waterproof jacket and pants were no match for this storm. As I trudged through the muddy path, my boots squelching and my fingers numb with cold, I spotted a small hut in the distance. It looked old and a bit worn out, but right then, it seemed like the coziest place on earth. Pushing against the wind, I made my way to the hut, hoping to find shelter and maybe a place to dry off. When I reached the hut, I was surprised to find that I wasn't alone. Inside, there was an old man sitting calmly by a fire, smoking a pipe. He looked like he had jumped out of a history book, with his wool trousers, suspenders, and a strange old-fashioned hat. Despite his odd appearance, the warm glow of the fire made him look friendly enough. The old man didn't seem surprised to see me at all. He just nodded slightly and gestured for me to come in. I didn't need to be asked twice. I stepped into the hut, grateful to escape the relentless rain. "Hello," I managed to say, shivering as the warmth began to seep into my bones. The old man just nodded again. "I'm Klaus," he said, in a voice that sounded like it was used to the quiet of the mountains more than the chatter of people. I introduced myself, trying not to stare at his old-timey clothes. As I hung my wet jacket near the fire, Klaus resumed his spot by the flames. I pulled up a chair, glad for the heat and the company, even if it was a bit unusual. We sat in silence for a bit, just listening to the crackle of the fire and the storm raging outside. Then, as if deciding that I was okay, Klaus began to talk. He told me stories about the Alps, tales of adventurers and explorers from long ago. His stories were interesting, but what really got my attention were the legends he shared. Stories about creatures that lived in the mountains, mysterious beings that were part human and part beast. As the wind howled like a banshee outside, Klaus's tales grew stranger and scarier. He spoke of echo spirits, eerie creatures that could mimic any sound, even human voices. "When the echo calls your name, that's when you run," he said, looking straight at me with a serious glint in his eyes. I tried to laugh it off. "Echo spirits, huh? That sounds spooky, but it's just a legend, right?" I wasn't so sure anymore, not with the storm making strange noises outside. Klaus didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, his face flickering with the flames, leaving me to wonder if some legends might be real after all. That night, even though I was tucked away inside the little mountain hut, sleep didn't come easy. Every sound the storm made seemed louder and scarier, thanks to the creepy stories Klaus had told me about echo spirits. I kept telling myself they were just old legends, nothing more. But every creak of the hut and howl of the wind made me think twice. The fire eventually burned down to just glowing embers, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I wrapped my sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to shake off the chill and the spooky feelings. I must have finally fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, everything was strangely silent. Morning light was peeking through the small window when I opened my eyes. I sat up, expecting to hear Klaus tending the fire or maybe humming an old tune. But there was nothing. No sound of footsteps, no crackling fire, no Klaus. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and looked around. The hut was exactly as small and rustic as when I'd entered, but there was no sign of the old man. The chair where he had sat the night before was empty, without even an indent in the cushion. His pipe, his hat, everything was gone. It was as if he had never been there at all. "This can't be right," I muttered to myself, my heart starting to race. I stepped outside, hoping maybe Klaus was just outside gathering more wood, but the area around the hut was deserted. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, crisp morning that made the night's fears seem distant and silly. Still, a part of me couldn't shake off the unease. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to leave the hut and its mysteries behind. As I set out on the trail again, the fresh air and bright sunshine helped lift my spirits. It was just a weird night, I told myself, trying to focus on the beautiful views and the adventure ahead. The path wound through lush green meadows and over sparkling streams, and I started to relax and enjoy my hike again. The mountains were peaceful, with only the sounds of birds and the occasional distant rumble of a waterfall. It was easy to believe that the scary stories from the night before were just that, stories. But then, just as I was getting comfortable, my name echoed across the valley. At first, I thought I was imagining things. "Hello?" I called out, half expecting no reply. But then it came again, my name, clearer this time. It sounded just like Klaus's voice. My heart skipped a beat. This has to be a joke. I thought, looking around nervously. There was no one in sight. The echo of my name seemed to bounce off the mountains, surrounding me. I remembered Klaus's words. When the echo calls your name, that's when you run. I wasn't about to run, not yet. I was curious, maybe a bit scared too, but I needed to know what was happening. The echo seemed to be coming from a cave nearby. I hesitated for a moment, then walked towards it. "Hello?" I called again as I approached the cave entrance. The echo that came back was chilling. It was my voice, but underneath it, there were other voices, like a dozen whispers tangled together. It felt wrong, deep in my bones. That was the moment I knew I should have listened to Klaus. Whatever was in that cave wasn't just an echo, it was something else, something that knew my name. Standing at the entrance of the cave, my heart pounded in my chest. The voices echoing back at me weren't just echoes. They were something more, something eerie. I knew I should run, just like Klaus had warned, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The whispers mixed with my name sent chills down my spine. It sounded like the voices were calling me, trying to lure me deeper into the cave. I remembered all the legends Klaus had told me, stories meant to scare, but maybe they were true. I took a deep breath, and against every instinct screaming inside me, I stepped back from the cave. "Time to leave," I muttered to myself, turning away from the dark opening in the mountain. But as soon as I started to walk away, the voices grew louder, and I could hear my name being called out again, this time more urgently. It felt as if the mountain itself was speaking to me. I broke into a run, my legs finally responding. The path was rocky, and I stumbled a few times, but fear pushed me forward. The echoes followed me, bouncing off the valley walls. It was like a wave of sound chasing me, growing louder with every step I took. The thought of looking back terrified me, so I kept my eyes fixed on the path ahead. My breath came in short gasps, and my muscles ached, but I didn't dare stop. The whispers seemed to be just behind me, always calling my name, mixed with those strange, otherworldly voices. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, I reached a river. The water rushed loudly, and for a moment I hesitated. The river was wide, and the water looked cold and deep, but the voices were still behind me, closer than ever. Without another thought, I jumped into the river. The cold water hit me like a wall, shocking me back to reality. I gasped for air, struggling against the current. The cold seemed to seep into my bones, but as I reached the other side and pulled myself onto the bank, I realized the voices had stopped. The sound of the rushing water had drowned them out. I lay there on the riverbank panting and shivering but relieved. Looking back across the water, the other side seemed so distant now, as if it was another world where the echoes couldn't reach me. I knew I couldn't go back the same way I came. Finally regaining my strength, I stood up and started walking again, this time towards the nearest town. I was done with the mountains and their secrets for now. The thought of spending another night out there, with those voices possibly finding me again, was too much. When I reached the town, I told people I had gotten spooked by the storm and decided to cut my trip short. I didn't mention the echoes or the cave. Who would believe such a story? They'd think I was just a scared kid with too much imagination. I've since read up on the legends and talked to other hikers online. Some have heard similar things, which makes me wonder. But now, I stick to group hikes, where there's safety in numbers. And whenever the wind howls, I never listen too closely, just in case it's not just the wind. People